We are a nation of animal lovers. Collectively, we share our homes with 90 million cats and 80 million dogs. We talk to them, keep their pictures in our wallets, celebrate their birthdays, travel with them, and greet them upon coming home even before we say hello to our spouse and kids. We include them in holiday celebrations and take time off from work to care for them when they are sick. And when it is time to say goodbye, we grieve. Every year, Americans spend more than $50 billion on their animal companions and donate hundreds of millions of dollars more to charities that promise to help animals, with the largest of these having annual budgets in excess of $100 million. And in a national poll, 96% of Americans, almost every single person surveyed, said we have a moral duty to protect animals, and we should have strong laws to do so. But the very agencies that the public expects to protect animals are instead killing millions of them annually.
Animal sheltering is the one industry where you can fail 80% of the time, 90% of the time, meaning every time you put an animal to death. There are some communities in the United States that are killing 60%, 70%, 80%, even 90% of the animals.
From the shores of California to the skyscrapers of New York, from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to the banks of the Rio Grande, shelters in the United States are killing animals by the thousands, and in some cases by the tens of thousands. It doesn't matter if the communities are large or small, northern or southern, rural or urban, rich or poor. Animals who enter shelters in need of a caring hand, some tender care and a loving home, don't find it. Instead, they are killed. Today, an animal entering an average American animal shelter has a 50% chance of losing his life. Some 4 million lose their lives every year, with shelters blaming a lack of available homes as the cause of death.
For too many years, we've been relying on the fiction that there are too many animals and not enough homes, and that is why we kill animals.
The party line among animal shelters in the United States is the only way to balance the arithmetic is to kill animals.
And yet over 7 times as many people acquire animals every year as there are animals being killed in shelters. Half of all animals who enter our nation's shelters go out the back door in garbage bags, rather than out the front door in the loving arms of adopters, despite the fact that there are plenty of homes available. Shelter killing is the leading cause of death for healthy dogs and cats in the United States. And for far too long, the American public has been led to believe there is no other way.
Our shelter was a pretty sad place to visit. We had a kill rate of up to 63%. The belief was that there were not enough homes for all the animals that came into the shelter. So many of them that came into the shelter were automatically killed, especially the elderly. Dogs, usually ages 5 and older, never were even given a chance, taken in the back and given the needle.
While some shelters have used the excuse of pet overpopulation to kill, other shelter administrators seeking to do better have turned to national organizations like the Humane Society of the United States for advice.
We pretty much depended on the national organizations, and what we were taught at the time is if you had upper respiratory running through the cat population, you killed them all. And you started fresh. You just disinfected everything, got new cats in, and away you went.
But there is hope. Over the last 2 decades, a growing number of shelter directors across the nation have implemented an innovative new approach to animal sheltering, the no-kill equation, a bold set of programs and services to increase adoptions, reduce birth rates, and keep animals with their responsible caretakers. And they are achieving unprecedented success. Today, Marquette, Michigan is a no-kill city. Instead of listening to large national organizations, shelter administrators turned to the animal lovers in their own community.
They were ready to jump in with both feet, and they just totally, absolutely believed that the public and the community would be behind us and they would support the changes. Because we had been hearing a lot over the years, people who were not happy with the fact that we were killing so many animals. And they had a lot of faith in that, and I'm really glad that they did, and it was their voices that carried the day.
Marquette is not alone. No-kill communities in which no healthy or treatable animals are killed can be found throughout the United States. They are part of a growing revolution in sheltering, which has the potential to end once and for all the century-old notion that the best we can do for homeless dogs, cats, rabbits, and other animals is to adopt out a few and kill the rest. This is the story of animal sheltering, which was born of compassion and then lost its way. It is the story of the no-kill movement, which says we can and must stop the killing. It is about heroes and villains, betrayal and redemption, and it is about a social movement as noble and just as those that have come before. But most of all, it is a story about believing in the community and trusting in the power of compassion. A story that begins in New York City 150 years ago.
Henry Bergh was the aristocratic son of a wealthy New York shipbuilder. His entire ambition seems to have been to serve his country in the diplomatic service, and it was a dream that he thought he had realized when he was appointed to the Tsar in St. Petersburg by then President Abraham Lincoln.
Secretary to the American legation in Russia. Such a great honor, Henry.
He thought he had realized his dream when he joined the diplomatic service. But he actually found his duties tiring and mundane, and he found himself spending less and less time on official duties and more time taking aimless rides around the St. Petersburg. It was actually on one of those rides where Henry Bergh found his true calling in life.
That poor beast cannot sustain another blow.
On one such ride, he witnessed a peasant beating his horse.
Henry Bergh ordered the man to stop, which the peasant did in deference to this well-dressed man of official position. Henry Bergh later wrote in his diary that it was exactly at that moment where he found his true calling in life.
At last, I found a way to utilize my gold lace.
Bergh returned to his native New York City, now filled with 1 million residents and discovered on every street, in every corner, as part of virtually every industry, a city built upon the suffering of animals and in desperate need of reform. At the time, New York City had the distinction of having more animal residents than any other city. 20,000 pigs and countless sheep roamed the streets, eating garbage on behalf of the cleaning department. Cows lumbering through the streets on the way to the slaughterhouse were as commonplace as the stray dogs and cats who made New York City their home. Even wild pigeons were peddled from wagons and carts at a few cents a dozen. But no animal was such an integral part of the New York City landscape, so responsible for the city's meteoric rise in size, and perhaps so consistently abused as the working draft horse. At the time, all inland travel was done by horse, on horseback, in wagons, or in carriages. Horses straining under heavy loads, starving and dying in the streets, or being beaten by caretakers, were a fact of New York City life, and scarcely resulted in a passing glance. Henry Bergh set out to change that. On February 8, 1866, to a well-filled room of attendees, including the mayor, Bergh delivered the first lecture on animal protection in the United States. He called upon the gathering to undertake a moral fight on behalf of animals.
This is a matter purely of conscience. It has no perplexing side issues.
You and the Society have my full, unfettered support, Mr. Bergh.
100 signatories signed Bergh's Declaration of the Rights of Animals, pledging themselves to suppressing cruelty and showing mercy. Armed with the declaration, Bergh secured a charter from the state of New York, incorporating the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the country's first SPCA.
And a few days after that, the legislature passed an anti-cruelty law, and Henry Bergh went to war.
Bergh would spend the better part of the next 2 decades in daily struggle for the animals in and around New York City.
Day after day, I am in slaughterhouses, or lying in wait at midnight with a squad of police near some dog pit. Through the filthy markets and about the rotten docks. Out into the crowded and dangerous streets. Lifting a fallen horse to its feet, or perhaps sending the driver before a magistrate. Beating a mangy, slowly starved cart horse. Penetrating dark and unwholesome buildings where I inspect collars and saddles for raw flesh, and then lecturing in public schools to children, and again to adult societies. Thus, my whole life is spent.
Turning to the event in the streets of St. Petersburg that inspired him, his first order of business was to better the plight of New York City's much-abused working horses. In 1832, New York had established the first horse railway in the world. By 1863, 16 lines of horse railways crisscrossed the city, and 500 horse-drawn cars made their way through traffic daily. Sickly and uncared-for horses struggled to pull overladen cars through the streets, often weighted down beyond their capacity, while impatient drivers lashed at them to proceed. With his new anti-cruelty law, Henry Bergh was determined to immediately stop such practices. The annals of the ASPCA describe the first such encounter.
The driver of a cart laden with coal is whipping his horse. Passers-by on the New York City streets stop to gawk not so much at the weak, emaciated equine, but at the tall man, elegant in a top hat and spats, who is explaining to the driver that it is now against the law to beat one's animal. Thus, America first encounters the great meddler.
Horses would be pulling carriages beyond their capacity through sleet and snow, with noses bleeding, not being very well cared for, and it was not uncommon for Henry Bergh to stop an entire line of horse-drawn carriages and asking everybody to unload to protect a single horse.
A man of great courage and conviction, Bergh believed in always doing what he thought was right, regardless of public clamor to the contrary, even when that clamor was, as it often was, unrelenting.
Mind your own business. It's my horse. And it's a ridiculous idea, Bergh.
2 or 3 years of ridicule and abuse have thickened the epidermis of my sensibilities, and I have acquired the habit of doing the thing I think right, regardless of public clamor. Let us dismiss and forget those that incriminate me.
Bergh spent each and every night tending to sick animals and hauling drivers who overworked them to the local justice for prosecution on charges of cruelty. Although the owners of the lines complained, Bergh would carry the day. Within 2 years of the ASPCA's incorporation, limits on passengers were common, horses were better cared for, and water troughs and buckets for thirsty horses could be seen throughout the city. One chronicler of Bergh's life noted that it was horses that Bergh championed above any other animals. But in truth, Bergh's ASPCA labored equally hard to protect stray dogs, particularly against abuses at the hands of city dog catchers.
every summer for a period of 90 days, the New York City Dog Pound would open its doors to rid the city of stray dogs.
The payment of 50 cents for each dog brought to the pound led to a profitable trade in dogs. Dogs were rounded up off the streets, from yards and from people's arms, and turned into the pound.
The pound at the time was essentially just a rough shed where dogs would be thrown in, left to their own devices. They would be held for a couple of days. In some circumstances, families would come forward and reclaim their dog. That they weren't provided food, they weren't provided water, because all those things took away from the profits of city dog catchers.
Left lying in their own waste, the dogs suffered until they were killed.
Those dogs that were not reclaimed by their families were drowned in the East River in what the local newspaper called the Terrible Iron Crate. And as many as 80 dogs at a time were put in this crate, with the largest dogs beaten on the head with a club so that they stayed underwater.
The struggling dogs were dropped several times in the East River in front of a crowd of neighborhood children until all the dogs had drowned.
It was that type of mistreatment of dogs that would focus so much of Henry Bergh's efforts.
Bergh succeeded in making it unlawful for city dog catchers to accept dogs from boys under the age of 18 in order to eliminate what he called the thieving gangs of young dog catchers. He forced the city to provide better housing for dogs. Because of intense ASPCA opposition, proposed laws modeled after those in other states, banning certain breeds or requiring them to be muzzled in public, failed to pass in New York. And in 1 year alone, the ASPCA prosecuted 12 cases of cruelty by city dog catchers. As a result, the number of dogs killed dropped by 80%.
Henry Bergh argued that the dogs didn't bother anyone and should be left alone.
Let us abolish the pound.
Tired of fighting Bergh, New York City's alderman offered his ASPCA money to run the dog pound, but Bergh would have none of it.
This society could not stultify its principles so far as to encourage the tortures which the proposed give rise to.
He didn't want his organization to do the city's bidding and kill dogs that they deemed unwanted.
Whether fighting for the rights of horses or protecting neighborhood dogs, Bergh's ASPCA grew in both scope and influence.
It didn't take long before other animal lovers in other cities began to model their own organizations after Henry Bergh's. And so these SPCAs and humane societies and animal protection organizations began to dot the American landscape.
By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, virtually every major city in the United States had its own SPCA or humane society. And all of them owed their existence to one man, the great meddler, whose act of compassion in St. Petersburg changed not only his life, but the lives of millions of animals. Toward the end of his life, Henry Bergh often lamented to his wife,
I hate to think about what might befall the society when I'm gone.
On March 12, 1888, as a storm whipped the city and gales tore the roofs off of houses, New York's horses pulled carloads of people through the snow. But for once, after 2 decades of policing the streets on their behalf, Bergh was not there to protect them. In the early hours of the morning, Henry Bergh had died. In a prophetic statement, the New York Post noted,
His society was distinctly a one-man power. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was Henry Bergh, and Henry Bergh was the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
Shortly after his death and against his wishes, the ASPCA accepted the pound contract, becoming New York's leading killer of dogs and later cats. In cities across the country, SPCAs and humane societies followed suit, abandoning their traditional platforms of advocacy and cruelty prosecutions in favor of running the dog pound.
We keep all dogs we receive, unless very sick or vicious, 5 days. Then those unclaimed are humanely put to death, except a limited number of desirable ones for which we can find good homes. We keep from 20 to 30 of the best cats and kittens to place in homes, and the rest are put to death. We do not keep a large number of animals alive.
What started out as a movement of hope was replaced with despair, and despair turned to anger. Shelters began to blame the public, the very people whose help they needed in order to save the lives of animals in their care. They enacted laws that put a stranglehold on the community, pet limit laws, licensing laws, even laws making it a crime to feed stray animals. As a result, compassion became control. As animal lovers who did not want to kill animals fled these organizations, working at a humane society became a job, not a mission. And animals, the healthy and treatable side by side with the hopelessly ill, died in shelters by the millions. Assuring themselves that there was no other way, shelter leaders generated workshops to help shelter employees cope with the killing. But innovation that would change the status quo got lost in the now all too familiar cliché that there are just too many animals and not enough homes. Until one city recaptured its roots. In the 1980s, the San Francisco SPCA was killing some 20,000 animals a year. Underfunded by the city, and because San Franciscans did not want to donate to an organization that did little more than kill animals, it had driven itself to bankruptcy. Facing financial ruin, the board of directors was forced to make a change.
In 1989, the San Francisco SPCA gave up the animal control contract and returned it back to the city, and the city built and ran its own pound.
Freed from using donor dollars to subsidize the pound, the SPCA would use those funds to save rather than end the lives of animals by implementing innovative new programs to increase life-saving. Programs such as foster care for orphaned puppies and kittens, medical and behavior rehabilitation for sick, injured, and traumatized animals, and neutering and releasing free-living cats who are not socialized to people.
The SPCA went back to its roots. It went back to the founding vision of Henry Bergh of focusing its efforts on protecting animals from people.
These and other programs, which the San Francisco SPCA pioneered, not only transformed animal sheltering in San Francisco, it redefined it nationwide. As the San Francisco SPCA opened its doors on July 1st, 1989, it did so for the first time in nearly a century without the title of Pound Master for the city and county of San Francisco. It was an historic beginning of an altogether different future for shelter animals, not of certain death, but a future that held promise, protection, and a new chance at life. To make that a reality, the SPCA offered to take every healthy dog and cat on death row at the city pound and find them all homes. The SPCA also offered to save thousands of sick and injured animals, and it would do so at no cost to taxpayers, taking on all the expense and responsibility. In return, city shelter staff would not kill these animals, but the city pound refused.
They gave two rationales for why they thought it was a bad idea. The first was that if the citizens of the city of San Francisco knew that any animal they surrendered to the shelter would be guaranteed a home, then the shelter would become overrun with animals. There would just be too many. And the second argument that they gave was that people would stop spaying and neutering. That people would think, oh, well, things are under control and we don't need to spay neuter anymore, and that they would stop doing that, and that, again, they would be overrun with animals.
Unwilling to allow the city pound to continue killing animals who had an immediate place to go, the San Francisco SPCA decided to seek legislation, the Adoption Act, which would have made it illegal for the city to kill animals if the SPCA or other rescue organization was willing to save them. But passing such a law would prove to be difficult.
The San Francisco Animal Welfare Commission was staffed by people who were also city bureaucrats. So you had not only the city pound, which was opposed, but the city police department and the city health department. And neither of those agencies wanted to go against what the city pound wanted.
The director of the city pound also enlisted the support of shelters in other Bay Area counties to join in opposition. National organizations entered the fray, defending the right of the city pound to kill animals, even in the face of a rescue alternative.
Shelter directors from around the country came to that meeting and spoke out against it, parroting the arguments that were being made by the San Francisco city pound.
Undeterred, the San Francisco SPCA fought back, threatening a public initiative if the pound did not cooperate.
They believed that if they could take this issue before the voters, that it would be a no-brainer to the voters. If the San Francisco SPCA wants to save the lives of animals on death row at the city pound, the people of San Francisco would have overwhelmingly supported it. And the city pound knew that it would be a very difficult thing to try to defend their resistance to that idea in the public forum.
The threat of a public referendum worked. The city pound backed down, and a voluntary agreement was reached.
What was going to be the Adoption Act turned into the Adoption Pact, an agreement between the San Francisco SPCA and the city pound that any animal on death row would go to the San Francisco SPCA, where they would be guaranteed a home.
While the city pound grudgingly accepted the new order, the animal-loving public supported the effort enthusiastically with hearts, homes, and wallets. Disproving the excuses offered by the city as to why the agreement was a bad idea, people adopted San Francisco shelter animals in record numbers. After the first year of the Adoption Pact, the deaths of healthy animals in San Francisco shelters dropped to 0, and the deaths of sick and injured animals dropped by 50%. At a time when most major urban cities were killing the majority of animals, indeed, some cities were killing over 90% of them, San Francisco's death rate had plummeted.
We had a great leadership. Animals were number one. The organization followed suit to do anything possible to help the dogs and cats in our community.
If you were a homeless dog or cat in the mid-1990s, San Francisco was the place to be. It had the lowest death rate of any community in the United States. And you would have expected that the heads of shelters that still killed the bulk of their occupants would have sent teams to San Francisco to figure out what is it that they're doing that we should be doing. How had San Francisco discovered the cure for the disease of shelter killing that was still ravaging communities across the country? That is what you would expect them to have done, because that is how ethical people would have behaved. But instead, they denigrated it. They claimed it was smoke and mirrors. They attacked it. They called no-kill a cancer, and they pledged to stop what was happening in San Francisco from happening in their own hometowns.
Despite the backlash, in communities across the country, people were now demanding solutions like San Francisco had achieved. Solutions these groups were not prepared to embrace.
We all grew up believing that if you worked at a humane society or ASPCA, it was because you loved animals. And we were also told that the killing was a necessary evil, and that nobody wanted to do it. And they wouldn't do it if there was any sort of alternative. And a lot of people believed it. But then when the San Francisco SPCA created an alternative model and showed them that indeed it wasn't just a necessary evil, it was just evil and we could end it, they didn't want to hear about it. They didn't want to know. And they felt so tremendously threatened by it that they did everything within their power to try to stop it.
Nothing was so unique about San Francisco that its success could not be replicated elsewhere in each and every American city. But that required leaders willing to embrace new thinking. And instead of following San Francisco's lead, the old guard rejected the programs that made life-saving success in San Francisco a reality.
When San Francisco was still killing, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. In fact, it was 90 days away from closing its doors forever. And its newfound wealth was not the cause of life-saving in San Francisco, but it was a product of the life-saving.
By the end of the 1990s, the San Francisco SPCA was at the peak of its success. It was beloved and supported by tens of thousands of San Franciscans. It had the lowest death rate of any major urban city in the United States. A no-kill city was within reach.
We were not only the only city in the country saving all healthy dogs and cats, but we were a whisper away from even ending the killing of all sick and injured and traumatized animals who could possibly be saved. The leadership responsible for bringing San Francisco death rates to all-time lows left the organization and went on to other pursuits.
This new leader came in and decided to really tear apart the programs and services that had worked so successfully over the years.
And in a very short period of time, programs were gutted, deficits were created, passionate people left the organization, and this great experiment in compassion that redefined sheltering for all time, that electrified the movement nationwide, turned around and rejected the very revolution that it had started.
The crown jewel of the no-kill movement quietly passed into obscurity. The question of whether or not no-kill could actually be accomplished was left for another community to answer.
I complained to the management of the shelter at the time about the practice of killing dogs and cats.
You were always afraid that you would come in to volunteer the next week and say, "Where's Cindy?"
I would come into work on Sunday and some dog that I had seen the week before maybe wasn't there. And I really didn't want to know.
We were told that no euthanasia questions should be asked of the staff.
There was an isolation ward at the end of the hallway.
It was basically first in, first out.
The main practice that caused animals to be needlessly killed at the shelter was killing them. They were being killed left and right.
The shelter in Tompkins County, New York, was typical of those nationwide. It had a poor public image. It killed a lot of animals, and it blamed the community for doing so. And even when people offered to help, management and the board turned them away.
We did talk with the shelter management and the shelter board about making changes, and we were met with opposition at practically every turn. When we presented new ideas, we were given all kinds of excuses.
We knew that it didn't have to be that way.
Some of the other volunteers and I did approach the management, both the shelter manager and the board of directors.
We simply kept on peacefully voicing our protests.
And I think that we also knew that we couldn't abandon the animals to their fate.
While employees socialized, it was the volunteers who cleaned the cages, fed the animals, counseled potential adopters, and administered medication to sick animals who otherwise would not have received it. And they, as well as the animals, often paid the price.
I had been interested in fostering kittens since I had heard about the program. I thought that it was a good idea. It was a way to save very young kittens that were too young to be in the shelter and too young to be put up for adoption.
She fostered a litter of healthy kittens until they were old enough to find homes. When they were ready to be returned to the shelter for adoption, she made sure they would be safe.
So I called and I asked if it was okay for me to bring my kittens back, if they had enough room for them. And I was assured that I would be called or emailed if they had a space crunch and they needed me to take any kittens back. And I gave them all my contact info. I wrote it on each set of paperwork. I distinctly, I remember just standing there and writing it down 5 times on their paperwork. And so put my kittens in their cage and said goodbye to them. And yeah.
Despite the assurances, 2 of them were killed.
I was just devastated. I started crying. I never got the phone call to take them back rather than have the shelter kill them.
She was not the only one.
One cat that I remember first seeing was a beat up, half of his ears were gone, a beat up orange tomcat. And one of the other volunteers at that session decided shortly after that to adopt that cat. I mean, she just was struck by him, she was going to adopt him. The day she came to pick him up, she came in the door, and I remember her coming in the door, and he had been euthanized, killed the day before. They did basically put down animals who had a guaranteed way out. All they had to do was phone a number, that person would come that day, get the animal, and these animals were getting killed.
Despite many roadblocks and many setbacks, despite being banned from the shelter, the volunteers continued to fight to reform the Tompkins County SPCA, taking the fight to the community and increasing the public pressure for reform. Tompkins County picked up where the San Francisco SPCA left off.
The executive director resigned, the board hired the right person.
I had just come from the most successful SPCA in the most successful city in the country, and I believed in the model, having seen firsthand how it brought San Francisco death rates to all-time lows. On my second day, the cages got full, and as someone brought in a litter of puppies, one of my staff members turned to me and said, "Who are you going to kill to make room for this litter of puppies?" And I turned to them and I said, "What is Plan B?"
There was none, but under the shelter's new leadership, killing was no longer an option.
Because we were a rural shelter, we had these horse troughs, and we brought them out, we filled them with shredded paper, and we put them in the lobby, and that's where we put the puppies.
People would come in and they'd see this galvanized tub full of fat little puppies, and nobody had to die to get those puppies a room.
So everyone who came into that shelter saw the puppies. It gave them some badly needed socialization, and each and every one of them was adopted out very quickly.
It was just, we are going to do this, period.
From that humble beginning, the goal of creating a no-kill community electrified Tompkins County.
Once our shelter declared that we were going no-kill, we had the support of the public. More people came to adopt animals, more people donated money. The public who loves animals beat a path to our door.
Despite taking in all lost, homeless, and relinquished animals from the 10 towns and municipalities that made up Tompkins County, the results were dramatic.
Tompkins County went from a community that killed healthy dogs and cats to killing none, that killed sick and injured but treatable dogs and cats to killing none, that killed unsocial community cats, alley cats, to killing none.
Overnight, by harnessing the public's compassion and changing the way the shelter operated, Tompkins County, New York became a no-kill community, saving not only all healthy animals, as San Francisco had done, but going further, saving all sick and injured but treatable animals, as well, including rabbits, hamsters, gerbils, and others. Whether they were young or old, healthy or sick, unweaned, injured or traumatized, whether they were blind, deaf, or missing limbs, the animals were all guaranteed a home, and they all found one.
It was unbelievable.
Everything changed, and it's like you could finally breathe.
To know that I didn't have to look at that ledger and see the D word for deceased.
For years, groups like the Humane Society of the United States, the American Humane Association, and the ASPCA had been fundraising, promising animal lovers that they were working to end the killing in U.S. shelters. And now the model to make that a reality had been achieved by others. But rather than celebrate, They ignored it.
It's almost like the keys to end shelter killing have not been discovered.
But for many animal lovers and some shelter directors, there was no turning back. Following the lead of Tompkins County, there are now hundreds of cities and towns across America that have also ended the killing of healthy and treatable animals, and the numbers continue to grow. Shelters are increasingly embracing the no-kill equation with unprecedented results.
We have been killing animals for over a century, and we have been saving lives for 15 years. So our movement is relatively new. But even in that short period of time, we have completely redefined the agenda all over the country.
Reno, Nevada bills itself as the biggest little city in the world. Little is a matter of debate. It and the surrounding communities that make up Washoe County have a population of over 400,000 people. But regardless of its size, Reno and Washoe County have big city problems, and for the animals entering the local shelter, the consequences were once dire.
Back then, the euthanasia rate was quite high. Staff would spend, a couple staff members would have to spend all afternoon euthanizing animals and filling up barrels full of dead pets and having the renderer take them away.
15 barrels of dead bodies were filled daily. Every evening the barrels would be emptied, only to be filled up again the next day.
I was asked by one of the senior staff at the Humane Society when they first started talking about the no-kill philosophy, and they asked me point blank, do you think it'll work here? And I told them quite honestly, I did not.
Washoe County takes in roughly 4 times the per capita rate of dogs and cats than Los Angeles, 5 times the rate of San Francisco, and 10 times the rate of New York City. As a tourism-based economy, it was especially hard hit by the Great Recession. Foreclosures were at record levels, and it had the second highest unemployment rate in the nation.
I really believe that it was only something that could exist in a very affluent community where the impounding and abandonment rates were much lower.
If there was anywhere that no-kill could not work, according to traditional sheltering dogma, it was Washoe County. Yet in spite of their skepticism, shelter managers were willing to try.
And at that time we entered into a partnership with the Nevada Humane Society. And things improved a little bit, but it wasn't until the Nevada Humane Society adopted the no-kill philosophy, that's when we saw a tremendous transformation.
Once you eliminate killing as an option, we're incredibly creative.
To be given an opportunity at something different than euthanasia or killing of the animal was appealing.
Truly, it was public pressure here in Reno that led the board to the conclusion that that was the direction they had to take here in this community.
So it took a little bit of work. I had to check some of my traditional thinking, and surprise, surprise, here we are.
Hi, how are you, little guy? How you doing, huh?
Creative thought and bringing creative solutions and not viewing anything as too far out to try has been a big part of our success.
Would I like it to happen faster for the other communities? Absolutely. Because I know they would find tremendous happiness and pride in that change.
For those working in shelters willing to go a new and different route, to not continue doing what they have always done just because they've always done it, the results have been dramatic, with life-saving rates as high as 99%, a scale that could only be dreamed about just a few years ago. But most refuse to innovate.
I look at all these animals down on their luck because of humans, or lack of care. But then when they get to humans, when they get to us, it has to be a place where they're helped, where we can reach out a hand and say, hey, buddy, come here, I'll help you. I'll put you in a good place, I'll find you a home, someone will love you, I'll give you food, I'll give you shelter. I'm not gonna take you in the back room and kill you because you had the misfortune of being in a bad place.
In the United States today, there are no checks and balances to ensure that our shelters are run in line with the most up-to-date sheltering policies and procedures. Instead, our shelters are run on the honor system. And it is a discretion shelter directors abuse time and time again by failing to implement life-saving alternatives or to work cooperatively with those who want to help them save lives. Not only are animals being needlessly killed, they are often denied basic medical care, food, water, and socialization, and sometimes they are treated cruelly. And when animal lovers try to change this, they often face retaliation, as a young rescuer in Southern California learned the hard way.
I went to the shelter because I was told they had a mother cat and 3 kittens that they had scheduled to be killed, even though they were healthy. When I arrived to pick up the cat and kittens, the shelter manager asked to see me.
Someone from your group wrote
She told me that a member of our rescue group wrote a letter complaining about the shelter to the Board of Supervisors and that they didn't appreciate it. She told me I could therefore only have 1 kitten. I begged her to let me take them all, but she said that I couldn't. She told me to pick one and she was going to euthanize the rest, including the mother cat. I didn't know what to do, and so I picked. My hand was shaking as I filled out the paperwork. After I got the kitten, I went outside and sat in the car. Then, I threw up all over myself.
It is a tragic story true to cities and towns across America, and the large national animal protection organizations are as much to blame as the individual shelter directors themselves. For decades, they have perpetuated the fiction that all is well in our nation's shelters. They have assured us that they are overseeing these organizations, providing guidance and assistance to make sure they are run humanely and effectively. In reality, they have ignored abuse and have remained deafeningly silent to the pleas of animal lovers for reform.
Town Lake Animal Center was killing over 14,000 animals a year. That's over 30 animals every single day, including weekends and holidays.
A local newspaper described the killing as follows.
A 7-week-old kitten weighs about a pound. His veins are the size of vermicelli. So if you are administering a lethal dose of sodium pentobarbital, an anesthetic agent blue as a summer sky, you'll probably inject it directly into his round spotted belly. If you have 5 cages of kittens to kill this morning, you don't have time to go looking for slippery little veins. A kitten with a hand gripping the scruff of his neck and a needle in his belly will squeal in terror, but once you've pulled out the needle and placed him back into a cage with his siblings, he will shake his head and start to get on with his kittenish business. Then he starts to look woozy and begins to stumble around. He licks his lips, tasting the chemical absorbed into his system. Soon, he becomes too sedated to stand. The animal collapses, and when his lungs become too sedated to inflate, he stops breathing. The killings begin shortly after 10 a.m. on a Wednesday in early October. By 10:32, the shelter is down about a dozen cc's of pentobarbital, and 20 cats are dead.
You had a lot of employees and upper management that were entrenched in maintaining the status quo. They were not open to new suggestions at all.
We literally had a policy that said every few days, animals that have been here X amount of days get euthanized. Yet we had 20 and 30 open kennels and cage spaces.
We ran into all the typical excuses as to why they couldn't change, why they had to do it the same way over and over.
Reforming Austin's shelter system would require no-kill advocates to fight back. Instead of helping them, the large national animal protection organizations, most notably an ASPCA no longer beholden to the vision of Henry Bergh, fought against them. But animal lovers, intent on reform, were unwilling to back down.
We had a night drop box. You could drop off a dog at night while nobody was there. So Helen was dropped off. Under our policies that existed at that time, she was defined as unadoptable. who's going to go and adopt a dog that has 9 puppies in their belly? So she was put on the kill list.
What it takes is a commitment. You have to draw the line in the sand.
Refusing to take no for an answer and holding elected officials accountable, reformers waged a political and media campaign. Helping to elect pro-no-kill candidates to the city council, the reformers eventually prevailed. The shelter's director was reassigned, and the city council voted unanimously to embrace the no-kill equation.
And it was that moment that something changed.
It was like day and night.
Austin Pets Alive, they took Helen, found her a foster home. She had 9 puppies. And then they adopted all of her puppies. We adopted Chucho, the last one. And then 2 weeks later, Helen was adopted by a family. There are 10 life companions in somebody's home right now that would not be there had it not been for someone thinking outside the box and thinking a little bit differently about how we do things.
Communities across the country have proved that there is enough love and compassion among the American public to overcome the irresponsibility of the few and to save all the lives at risk.
By engaging our community to support animals, by reaching out to the community, people want to help animals.
There is now a solution to shelter killing, and it is not difficult, expensive, or beyond practical means to achieve. With a generous, compassionate, animal-loving American public, ready and willing to help end the killing, only one thing stands in the way of doing so: a deeply troubled and dysfunctional animal protection movement that undermines the effort at every turn. When the early founders of the movement died and their organizations took over the job of killing those they had been formed to protect, a fiery zeal was replaced with a smoldering ember that gave little light or warmth, and the humane movement went to sleep. But after over 100 years, it is finally waking up.
All the old excuses, all the old stories are falling by the wayside.
3 out of 4 people believe it should be illegal to kill animals in shelters if those animals are not suffering.
It's a crime. It's just a crime to let these poor critters be killed.
No kill is on the agenda of shelters nationwide. It is being debated in legislatures across the country. And there are now hundreds of cities and towns across America which have achieved save rates between 90% and as high as 99%. Working in earnest to return the term euthanasia to its dictionary definition, the act or practice of killing hopelessly sick or injured individual animals in a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy.
When animal-loving people find out how shelters are operating and that there's an alternative, there's only one way they're going to be able to go. They're going to have to stop killing.
I think it's really, the opposition is starting to realize that it is possible anywhere.
I always thought it would be possible.
And our lives are forever changed.
When we tell people that there is actually a compassionate, life-affirming option that doesn't involve killing animals, and it is a revolution that is sweeping across the country, we have every single one of them willing to follow us into that more compassionate future.
There is great public pressure to save the homeless dogs and cats, and I think it's inevitable that every shelter will be a no-kill shelter, and that will be the norm.
People from all over the country, other cities, agencies are contacting us on a regular basis, wanting to know how they too can have what we have.
This is an unstoppable freight train that's moving across the country.
When you accomplish it, everybody wants to be on board. Everybody jumps on that train.
As more and more communities end the killing of animals now and forever, people in other communities are starting to ask the question, what is Plan B?
It was like the sun had been behind a cloud for years, and it came out.